Christopher signed the divorce papers with a practiced flourish, the nib of his pen scratching loudly against the heavy bond paper in the sterile Manhattan mediation room. He didn't look at me. He was too busy leaning back, a smug, liberated smirk settling into the corners of his mouth as he tapped out a text to his mistress, Brittany. I watched the reflection of his screen in the polished mahogany table, something about Cabo, the sun, and finally being free of dead weight. To him, I was just a broke museum archivist, a quaint accessory he had outgrown on his climb to the top of the corporate ladder. He thought he was cutting loose an anchor, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actually sawing through the only safety line he had left. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I sat across from him, dressed in the same simple black dress I had worn to my mother Michelle's funeral only 3 days prior. Christopher hadn't attended. He had sent a generic card signed by his assistant, claiming a work crisis required his undivided attention. I knew the truth. The crisis was a blonde named Brittany and a reservation at a 5-star resort. As the hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence, I felt ancient. People assume marriages end with a bang, but ours had died by 1,000 tiny cuts. For 7 years, I had been the silent investor in his version of a life, while he methodically whittled away at my soul. Christopher wore his ambition like a second skin, convinced he was the artist and I was merely a blank canvas he was sculpting into something better. He hated my career at the museum. To him, archiving history was an indulgence, something quaint that made him look like he had married down. At dinner parties, he would squeeze my knee under the table, a practiced signal to stop talking because my thoughts on historical preservation were boring the serious people who moved markets. He mocked my friends for being average and criticized my clothes, suggesting I dress more like the polished wives of his superiors. The irony was paralyzing. He mistook my silence for weakness and my patience for stupidity. Every Tuesday morning for 5 years, I left the house at 6 o'clock. He assumed I was headed to a yoga class or a book club, and he never once asked a single question about it. He was too consumed with his own reflection to notice that I wasn't dressed for yoga. I wasn't going to a book club. I was going to the very high-rise where he worked, taking a private elevator to the top-floor penthouse boardroom. I sat in the back, observing and voting on the strategic direction of the companies that owned his entire world. While he was flirting with receptionists in the lobby, I was his boss. I endured his condescension because of a promise I made to my mother. She understood the isolation of extreme wealth and made me swear an oath to hide my light. "If a man loves you when he thinks you are nothing," she had whispered, "then he deserves you when he finds out you are everything." Christopher had fallen for the trap, but he had failed the test spectacularly. When I came home from the hospital after she took her last breath, empty and shattered, he didn't offer a hand to hold. Instead, he asked if I was going to be moping around for long because he had a district review coming up and needed the house to be cheerful. That was the moment the test ended. He had proven exactly who he was, and now, the debt he owed was about to be collected in full. Judge Marlene Keats, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too many broken promises to be surprised by anything, adjusted her glasses. She reached for the divorce papers Christopher had just signed with that insufferable smirk, ready to stamp them and send us into our separate futures. "The terms seem standard," she said, her voice flat and routine. "Prenuptial agreement enforced. No alimony. Separate property remains separate. If you are ready to sign, Mrs. Caldwell, we can conclude this." I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I slid an embossed black folder with a red wax seal across the polished mahogany table. "Before I sign," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself with its clinical calmness, "there is a document that must be entered into the record." Christopher let out a sharp, derisive laugh and didn't even look up from his phone. "Oh, come on, Samantha," he sneered. "What is it? Did your mother leave you her collection of antique thimbles? Or maybe that old sedan? Just keep it. I don't want anything from your side of the family. I just want out." I watched the screen of his phone reflect in the glass table as he checked for messages from Brittany. He thought he was the protagonist of this story, the hero liberating himself from a burden. He had no idea that my silence for the last 7 years had been a house of glass, and I was finally ready to throw the first stone. This was the invisible chain of the survivor, the strategic discipline of hiding my light until the man I shared a bed with proved he was either worth everything or worth nothing. Judge Keats broke the wax seal with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. She pulled out the document, heavy bond paper meant for treaties of immense consequence. I watched her eyes scan the header, then stop abruptly. She blinked, adjusting her glasses as she leaned closer to the page, her brow furrowed in disbelief. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, searching my face for the archivist she thought she knew. Then looked at my simple black dress and back at the paper, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the page. The silence in the room changed texture, turning into the heavy, suffocating stillness of a bomb that had been armed but not yet detonated. Christopher was still scrolling, mentally sipping cocktails in Cabo. Judge Keats cleared her throat, a loud, deliberate sound. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice losing all traces of routine fatigue. He waved a hand dismissively. "Just give me the pen when she's done playing games, Your Honor. I have a flight to book." Judge Keats did not hand him the pen. She set the document down with extreme care, as if it were made of glass, and spoke with a sudden, terrified respect. "Mr. Caldwell," she repeated, and this time her tone was a command that brooked no argument. "I advise you to look up." The judge began to read the asset confirmation for the estate of Michelle Moore, and the name of the entity hit the room like a physical blow. Vantage Global Realty. My husband's thumb froze over his screen as he realized the broke wife he was discarding was now the legal owner of the company that signed his paychecks. The judge's voice stripped the room of its oxygen as she read the valuation audit. $180 billion. It was a figure that belonged to nations, not individuals, and it was now mine, transferred automatically upon my mother's death. Christopher's face went slack, the color draining from his tanned skin until he looked like a sketch of himself. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air that was no longer there. "Wait," he stammered, his hands scrambling over the polished mahogany table for the papers he had pushed away only minutes earlier. "Wait a minute. If that money is hers, then as her husband, I am entitled to." Judge Keats cut him off with a sharp glare. "You are entitled to nothing," she interrupted, picking up the prenuptial agreement he had insisted upon 7 years ago. It explicitly stated that any inheritance remained the sole and separate property of the beneficiary. He had signed away a claim to an empire to protect a checking account that held less than what I now made in interest every hour. But the lethal discovery was yet to come. "There is an addendum," Judge Keats said, squinting at the fine print. The file indicated that a proxy using the initials V. Moore had held veto power over the board of Vantage Global Realty for 5 years. Christopher stopped breathing. For years, he had complained to his colleagues about V. Moore, calling the mysterious board member a clueless relic and a bureaucratic nightmare in internal memos because I blocked his most reckless, high-risk proposals. He had spent half a decade insulting his boss to her face without ever seeing her face. I finally moved, placing my hands flat on the table. "I do not go to a book club on Tuesdays, Christopher," I said, my voice calm and devoid of the anger he expected. "I take the private elevator to the top floor. I sat behind the tinted glass when you tried to cut safety inspection budgets just to boost your quarterly bonus." He flinched as if I had struck him. This was the silent regret of the watchman, a lesson my mother Michelle had architected into my life. She had been burned by men who saw only dollar signs, and she had trapped Christopher in a long-term test of character. He had been too consumed with his own reflection to notice the woman sleeping next to him was the one holding the sword. He had signed the divorce papers to get rid of a burden, having no idea he had just handed the executioner her weapon. By the time I reached the elevators of the Vantage Global Realty Tower that afternoon, the atmosphere in the building had shifted like the drop in air pressure before a tornado. At exactly 2 o'clock, a company-wide update regarding the new leadership had hit every phone in all 42 floors. I adjusted the cuff of my charcoal blazer, no longer the quiet wife, but the chairwoman. Christopher was 10 paces behind me, breathless and frantic, after having his badge suspended by security. "Samantha, please," he hissed. as the elevator doors opened. "We can fix this." "I didn't know. I was just trying to protect us." "Tear up the papers. We can start over." "I love you." I turned to look at him with a flat finality. "You signed it, Christopher. And unlike you, I read what I sign." The doors slid shut, cutting off his desperate reach. I walked straight into the main boardroom, where the senior leadership team looked at me with a terrifying mixture of respect and fear. Christopher slipped in a moment later, looking like a man walking to the gallows. I didn't fire him immediately. Firing him would be a mercy. Instead, I authorized an independent external audit of all personnel files and bonus structures. "If your performance is genuine," I said, my eyes locking onto his, "you have nothing to fear. But if your position was built on inflated metrics or stolen intellectual property, we will find out." 10 minutes later, the forensic audit began in a windowless server room. Kieran, the lead investigator, soon found the evidence of Christopher's intellectual parasitism. He correlated metadata from our home IP address to Christopher's strategic proposals. Christopher had stolen my research for the suburban density model, a concept I had sketched on our kitchen island while he watched football, and sold it to the company as his own genius. More rot surfaced. Christopher had been falsifying occupancy rates for 12 consecutive quarters, robbing maintenance budgets to hit his bonus thresholds. He wasn't just a cheating husband, he was a corporate parasite. This was the reality of the world without Michelle, the third module in my mother's lesson. Without her strategic loyalty test, Christopher would have continued his ascent, fueled by my stolen ideas, eventually bleeding the company dry while keeping me in a psychological cage. My mother hadn't just given me an empire. She had given me the tools to prevent a disaster that would have consumed my entire future. I picked up the phone to the forensic team. "Find out who in finance authorized these overrides," I instructed. "I want the dam to break by morning." The internal disciplinary hearing didn't take place in the grand boardroom, but in a small, glass-walled breakout room that felt more like an interrogation cell. Christopher sat across from me, his composed exterior finally crumbling into a frantic, sweating desperation. He still believed he had a play left, that his media stunt about my vindictive revenge would force a settlement. He was counting on his platinum severance package, a payout of nearly $6 million to start his new life with Brittany. "You need to be reasonable, Samantha," he stammered, trying to summon a ghost of his old charm. "We can settle this quietly. I have a mortgage. I have debts. You wouldn't want a public scandal to drop the stock price further." "I'm not here for a scandal, Christopher," I said, my voice clinical. "I'm here for the audit." I signaled to the door, and Brittany walked in. Christopher froze, his breath hitching as the woman he thought was his accomplice sat down as a witness for the company. Brittany hadn't come to apologize. She had come to survive. She played a recording of their conversation at the wine bar where Christopher admitted to stealing the density models and planning to join a competitor. She then handed over a thread of text messages that delivered the kill shot. Christopher had told her I'd be history and penniless once the papers were signed. The evidence of malicious intent was irrefutable. I watched Christopher realize his power was nothing but the illusion of the empty wallet. His authority, his tan, and his expensive chronometer were all rented by a company that no longer belonged to him. Without the $180 billion machine behind him, he was just a small man in a tailored suit who had forgotten that gravity applies to everyone. His status wasn't a part of his character, it was a subscription I had just canceled. The board members, people who once laughed at his jokes and sought his favor, now looked at him with a mixture of disgust and fear. He had legislated himself into professional and financial bankruptcy. Christopher slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, as the reality of his total erasure settled into the room. He had signed away his freedom to escape a burden, only to find that he had handed the executioner her sword. Christopher looked at me, his eyes wide and trembling, searching for a single trace of the woman who used to stay silent to keep the peace. "Samantha, please," he whispered, his voice cracking as he reached for a dignity that was already gone. "I have a mortgage. I have debts. I pushed too hard. I know. But $6 million is my right. I can apologize. I can fix this." Apologies do not fix systems, Christopher. I cut him off. My voice is calm and sharp as a surgeon's blade, but the truth does. I slid a final sheet of paper across the table, the Christopher clause. It was an amendment he had lobbied for himself 3 years ago to ensure a sales director left with nothing after padding expense reports. It stated that any executive found to have knowingly manipulated financial data or committed fraud forfeited all rights to severance and stock options. He had built the very trap that just caught him. I turned away from him, addressing the room with absolute authority. Effective immediately, Mr. Caldwell is terminated for cause. As security escorted him out, he didn't yell. He simply vanished into the silence of his own making. I immediately moved to new business, reinstating the original design credits to David and the architects Christopher had robbed. We were building a company where transparency was not a slogan, but a survival strategy. This was the final stage of letting go of bloodlines. Finding yourself. I realized that revenge is a fire that burns everything it touches, but justice is a cool, clean rain that leaves the foundation standing. I had not crushed him. I had simply removed a glitch in the system. Later that evening, standing in the glass corridor on the 42nd floor, I looked out at the New York skyline. I held the open, red-sealed envelope, my mother Michelle's final lesson. She hadn't given me a weapon. She had given me a mirror to define myself. To those of you listening who have ever felt like the outsider in your own life, remember that your light is your own, and you don't need anyone's permission to be luminous. I was 34 years old, the chairwoman of a $180 billion empire, and for the first time in 7 years, I was completely, beautifully free. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own life, remember, your light is your own. Share this story if you believe justice always finds its way. Stay strong.